So what are those unintended consequences? Well, this is an interesting piece of data. I told you that we have over 2 billion people on the internet, and there was a book out by Martha Stepp. Do you remember hearing about it? It was kind of a bestseller here a few years back, The Sociopath Next Door. And she claimed that 1 in 25 people were sociopathic. So do the math. When I was a little kid, my mother could give me simple instructions. There were 6 people in the community I had to avoid, and I could count them on 2 hands, and I knew who they were, and I knew that Joey was at the top of the list. Joey was a bad seed. He was always in trouble with the law. We avoided him at all costs because Mom was a little tougher than probably the police were. That was simple. I could go out all day long, roam the streets, ride my bike, and I just had to worry about 6 people. Now we have children logging on to the internet, and if 1 in 25 are sociopathic, what are we exposing our children to? And this is not an idle concern. A colleague who's the Chief Information Security Officer for the prison system in the state of Washington tells me that there has never been a pedophile that he's locked up who hasn't had a Facebook account. And why is that? I think it was Sarah that mentioned we can describe ourselves and shape our identities online. That's exactly what evil-intended people have learned to do. I don't know if you recall the story about a 16-year-old girl from Michigan who fell in love on the internet, got on an airplane, and ended up going to the West Bank to meet her intended. She thought he was 18 years old. Fortunately, the authorities caught her at the border before she went inside because her intended was a 52-year-old, tooth-gapped individual who was trolling for kids. So we've seen a change in the threat spectrum. How many of you remember War Games, the movie War Games, where the kids were doing all kinds of things and they were changing their grades? Well, we've come a long way. Those days of the thrill seeker, it doesn't mean that they're not out there, but I remember those nuisance infections you used to get on your computer. There'd be a wrecking ball that wiped out your interface, etc. Those days are gone. We moved very quickly about a decade ago to people who were interested in monetary gain. They recognized they had excellent skills, so they farmed themselves out to people that wanted to get even for one thing or another. But it didn't take long for Tony Soprano and his friends to discover the internet. Now, not all criminals are stupid. To be able to sit in a lovely apartment in a jurisdiction where there's no treaty that describes online crime, and with impunity draw down money from bank accounts all around the world is a whole lot safer than taking a machine gun and walking through the front door and risking your own life and limb. So criminals aren't dumb. And certainly organized crime discovered the internet, and then all bets were off, because now we have funding and we have intent. And so we've seen a huge escalation in crime on the internet. And we don't want to discount the activities of nation states, because they certainly have moved to cyber war. If you recall, in 2007, the Estonians were completely cut off of the internet. The Russians punished them for some political activity that had to do with taking down a statue of a war hero. Shortly thereafter, when the Russians invaded Georgia, it was preceded by cyber action. Ever since, the gloves have been off. Look at Stuxnet. So warfare and national security activities have moved online. There are whole battalions in various armies that are devoted to studying how to attack online. And what do you think they're going after? What would your targets be? People who are World War II buffs. People who remember reading about the Blitz. What did the enemy go after?
Energy, power.
Correct, critical infrastructure. And I hate to tell you, that stuff is accessible online. So you have some real motivations by nation states to do unpredictable things, and just stay tuned, because I can tell you, as somebody who was working late at night, I have a relative who speaks Russian, and he happened to be watching the May Day parade from Moscow, and of course he probably felt some nostalgia, I don't know. But the announcer was speaking in Russian, and I get a call from the other end of the house, come here, your people are marching. And here comes a battalion of cyber warriors, trained by the Russians, goose-stepping down Red Square. This was several years ago. So we've seen an escalating threat spectrum, and you need to know about it, because this activity is going on the same internet you're using. At the same time, what we've seen in terms of trends is that the ease with which people are able to exploit things on the internet has increased. You've had to have less skill to do increasingly complex things. There are whole sites out there with tools that assist hackers. How convenient. Hackers are very sharing people. Here's a quote from McAfee. I think it goes back about a year, where he's stating, the CEO states that cybercrime has become a huge business, and it now surpasses the illegal drug trade in the world. I've heard the same from the FBI in the States. They make the same comment. So what we have is a threat spectrum that's very dynamic. We also see that the attackers are adapting. When we talked about, in the nuclear age, we talked about the nuclear arms race. We now see the same thing moving into cyberspace. So as we get better, they get better. And there's huge motivation to do so. When you're talking about large money targets, when you're talking about nation-state interests, there's a dramatic impetus to continue to improve. We see increased professionalism. There's a lot of money behind organized crime and nation states to improve attacks. So here's some interesting quotes. This is our Chief Information Security Officer at UW. He predicts a huge number of systems and research programs, classified and unclassified, on our campus. And he basically says, if the internet were a street, I wouldn't walk it in daytime. Here's something from the FBI, law enforcement. 75% of traffic, I don't know where he gets his number, but I'm just indicating that there is a consensus around the size and impact of criminal activity online.